Back to the Nutrimedical Report, and of course it is Wednesday. We are the April 6th show, and of course first hour we have Harley Schlanger from the Roosh Foundation. Harley, are you there?
I'm here. How are you?
Wonderful. We have an hour, and we have lots of stuff to talk about. Let's focus on the key issues that are not only going to help the human race survive, especially Americans here, but the human race survive, and what do we need to do to kind of fix the current issues? A lot of time the distraction on the media is like a dogfight in the Republican Party or the surge of Bernie Sanders, despite the fact they're stealing away his chance of getting a nomination. We have those issues really are not the most important ones, are they? There's more important issues that need to be dealt with that are going to overwhelm it very shortly, aren't they?
Well, let's take one that's a very interesting and surprising one, which is an event that took place yesterday or 2 days ago at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. Now, most people know you could look at anything coming out of the Federal Reserve with a great deal of skepticism, since it's probably an unconstitutional institution which has been at the center of the mess we have financially. But then secondly, the new president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve is a guy named Neil Kashkari, and Kashkari is a guy who was the assistant to Hank Paulson when Paulson was doing the bailouts. So one might be legitimately questioning, well, why are they having a conference on banks being too big to fail? Well, the interesting thing is they had people who concluded that you've got to break up the big banks.
Right.
And if you don't, you're going to have a blowout that's going to be uncontrollable. Now,
right, exactly.
I find that quite interesting because this is what, of course, Lyndon LaRouche has been saying for a long time, that you cannot sustain the present banking system without impoverishing to death huge numbers of Americans. Now, the one thing that was also discussed at this conference was the problem of the big banks is that they're circulating and protecting a lot of bad assets, bad debt. But I don't think, and I haven't read the full transcripts, but I don't think that anyone called for a debt reorganization or restructuring or forgiveness. Now,
right.
There are calls internationally to write off some of this debt, a lot of this debt. So all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere from an unexpected place, the Federal Reserve, there's a call to do something which makes sense.
Right.
Now, the question is, are they doing this because they know something even worse is about to happen that caused them to make this push, or is it just something they're just trying to keep some credibility? But regardless, we have to run with it. We've got to make this an issue for all people.
Right. Now, I'll tell you what my suspicion is. The powers that be know that there's areas where there are drivers of the world economy that they are no longer in control of, and that a disaster is coming, and they're trying to do a preemptive attempt to end around it. Just like, for example, they started negative interest rates, and they started to create new vehicles, which is why they basically they fooled Gerald Celente and other pundits that talked about the collapse coming even last year. I think there are elements that mean they're no longer in control, and they're now scrambling to do something to maintain some control in the last year of Obama's presidency, but also to maintain their control of the banks that control the world and the trade zones. Because really what's going on with Europe, with the Haraj to actually invade, is again a globalist policy to break down nation states. That's why Obama has an open border. It's the situation where the banks basically want to create a gruel class and wipe out the middle class, make us all totally dependent on the superstate and the trade zones that are under their control. So they're grabbing all the wealth on the planet. They're doing this through derivatives and so on now, but they can't even make money on the derivatives markets anymore after the last 3 years. So I think the game is up, and they don't want to tell the fact that they don't have control anymore. And
well,
what they're doing is they're scrambling.
I mean, there's no question, but the foolishness of trying to predict a day in which it's going to collapse.
No, you can't predict it. You can't predict it. Yeah. That's the problem. They always have new schemes that they'll try to pull.
And also, Bill, you can't even know exactly what the trigger will be because there's so many fuses and so much gasoline that's been poured on it. You don't know where the ignition will occur.
The list can change, but the menu. Let's put it this way: it's like getting a menu in a restaurant, and every week they move the menu items around, but the menu is still relatively the same. First, for example, on top of the list is the derivatives market is likely to crash because it's all leveraged on the price of oil. The second issue is the Mideast is a firestorm ready to happen. And what the Russians done is basically delay that disaster by taking out ISIS. The third issue is the collapse of Europe. Europe is not doing well financially, and the current migrant issue is amplifying the whole problem. Most of the states want to get out of Europe, but they can't really get out of the Euro system. Here in America, we have 95 million Americans basically unemployable or not even on the unemployed lists. 65 million on basically on some form of government support, and 55 million plus on food stamps. We have a disaster in America. We're in a prolonged recession. And, you know, the comment that Trump made I thought was quite funny. I said, we are going to go to a very deep recession, and he paused, if you don't elect me. And I agree with him. I think that we're basically now man the boats. Things are really going to start getting ugly this year. And if you don't have the right person on the helm, which is why we need also better policies, I heard that he's going to pivot and put up policy statements. I think he needs a lot of help from people like LaRouche Foundation to put up policy statements that, number one, can work, and policy statements that actually correct the underlying problem, which is, you can't just put out something because you have to put out something. You have to put out something that if you can run through the election with it against opposition, and you can actually start implementing, without all the details, because you're going to negotiate. But I think Trump needs help. He wants to do something, but I think he needs help from the LaRouche Foundation and others to actually put in policies that are actually doable. The other people like Cruz and the Inside are not going to do it.
This is also bigger than Donald Trump, because what Trump is up against, and he's correctly identifying that it's a collapsing system that's trying to stop him. But his problem is that he hasn't identified the solutions yet. But look, regardless of what Trump says or doesn't say, what's real is that people are totally confused by the crisis. And, our job, and when I say our, I include you in this and me and the people that I work with internationally,
right.
We've got to put forward solutions that people can see how they would affect them.
Well, we already have some. In fact, we talked about this for years.
Yeah.
Glass-Steagall, putting it back in, wiping out debt that's to the Federal Reserve, which is an illegal institution, having borders and having a nation, but having a rapid immigration process that's not super expensive, and having cultural immigration, so you can bring people from countries that will not destroy our culture. The idea of bringing in an unfettered amount of Muslims into this country, whether they're extreme or not, is not a good idea, because in 20 years it will cause the Islamification of America. The problem is they're bringing them in without even stopping the immigration people who could be nice people, along with potential terrorists, because Obama would like to have martial law and have a bipartisan bill to declare some form of martial law so he can preempt even elections. He wants to be president for life.
But this whole narrative has been changed by the victories that the Syrian army with Russian help are gaining now in the Middle East. Because Obama, the period of the U.S. as the nation you go to is over. Right. People are beginning to realize the United States under Obama no longer has the moral authority.
That's a big important part of it, but believe it or not, if you actually look at the list of where these people are coming from, they're not just coming from Syria and Iraq, they're coming from a whole range of Muslim countries, North Africa and elsewhere. So the vast majority of them are young men between 18 and 25. They are not just from Syria and Iraq. They're not just escaping ISIS who are going to try to recruit them.
Well, they're from Libya and parts of North Africa where ISIS is killing them.
Right, and here's the problem. ISIS isn't going to be stomped out even, they're doing well in Syria because of Russian help. But we have a full war. Obama's prosecuted a war with the Air Force, which is to me a criminal faux war that has rebombed cities that are bombed hundreds of times. And with a smaller number of bombing runs, etc., the Russians cleaned out ISIS, and now the Syrian army and Peshmerga forces are taking over. So Obama is a criminal. The military acting in an illegal and irresponsible way not to work with the ground forces of the Iraqi Shiite militia and the Iranians try to clean up this mess. And they want the mess. And Obama is frustrated by the fact he can't do regime change. Everything is nuts, and Obama needs to be impeached. That's part of the whole process of fixing this. Let's gotta go through these things slowly, methodically, because a lot of people they have difficulty keeping up with all of these things because they've been so brainwashed by the media. I call it medium, almost like a psychic medium trying to kind of brainwash you. That it's hard for them to understand the decisions. We've been at this for a long time, so for us it's pretty darn clear and it's straightforward, and it's pretty catastrophic what's going on because there's a lot of dangers. that people don't realize we're in a greater danger now than the Cuban Missile Crisis back in the early 60s. We're in much more danger of a world financial collapse. And none of this needs to happen. We're in much more danger of a world war with the triggers all over the place. It's almost like walking through a minefield. If you make a misstep, everything blows up.
Well, let me just start this segment by urging people who have the time to, at 10 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, so it's early, it's 7 a.m. Pacific Time, but on the LaRouche PAC website, we're going to be live streaming a conference in New York City on building the world land bridge, realizing mankind's true humanity. And it's going to feature people who are involved in the land bridge from China, from Egypt, from other countries, with a keynote from Mrs. LaRouche. She's going to be speaking at 10 a.m. And you can get this at LaRouchePAC.com. So I think if people want to make sense out of the world, a good place to start, since Mrs. LaRouche is known internationally as the leading proponent of what the Chinese have adopted, this idea of the Eurasian land bridge. You know, you and I were talking about this 6-7 years ago. It's now the government policy of China and about 25-30 other governments, the so-called One Road, One Belt. So that's going to be tomorrow morning, April 7th, at 10 a.m. Eastern at LaRouchePAC.com. Now, if you can't see it live, it'll be archived, and it's going to go all day, so you'll be able to follow it and then get Mrs. LaRouche's keynote later. Now, on the point you were just making, in the last days, there were two things Obama has done which are putting us closer to nuclear war. One is a potentially immediate trigger, which is after his meeting with Xi Jinping, where the Chinese leader said to him, "You've got to stop challenging our sovereignty over our territory." And Obama nodded in agreement, and then 2 hours later the Navy said they're going to challenge the Chinese authority to proclaim these islands that they're building are part of their territory. These are islands that are attached to islands that are already recognized as Chinese territory. So the idea that we have to challenge China in the South China Sea in order to remain a world power, this is nonsensical. It's poking an eye in the Chinese at a point where the Chinese are saying to us, look, we're holding all your debt. Let's work together. Put that to use.
Well, they're not holding all the debt. They're holding $1.7 trillion. But the fact is, we are, in a sense, business partners. They make goods. We buy goods. They could be working with us to do all kinds of things to reduce world pollution by us giving them natural gas. What's really going on here is we should be natural allies to Russia and China, and our culture will change their culture, which is extreme with the communist socialism, will mutate over the decades, so they will have a much more westernized culture. It
already is mutating. It already is changing.
Right.
They want that. You see, Putin is not the demon that Obama thinks he is. Putin is acting on behalf of Russia's interests. Now, the other thing that Obama did, the first thing was this China threat. The second thing is that he had this showboat conference on reducing nuclear weapons and the access of nuclear material to terrorists and so on. You know, Obama's grandstanding, this is why he got the Nobel Peace Prize. At the very moment that this conference was underway in Washington, one of his top nuclear people in the Army, General Klotz, was testifying before a Senate committee on why they need, for this next year's budget, about $20 billion for upgrading the nuclear force. So here's Obama telling the world, we're reducing weapons and you should reduce weapons and we should have a plan to get out of the nuclear business altogether, nuclear weapon business. At the same time, they're asking Congress for more money to build these pinpoint missiles that are designed to win a nuclear war. And even a warmonger like Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California, was shocked by this, and she said, look, what you're talking about is making nuclear more possible, so I don't see how we can possibly support this. And they had this general try to convince her, and at the end he said, so I don't think I've convinced you. And she said, no, you're making a case that can't be made. How are we reducing nuclear war by making use of nuclear weapons more likely? And that's what Obama is doing. Now, the third thing is General Breedlove, the outgoing commander of NATO forces, gave a speech in Brussels where he said that we need to have permanent U.S. troops deployed on the border of Russia in the Baltic countries, Poland, and Ukraine, so that if we go to war with Russia, we can penetrate them quickly, and we need this new bomber that can degrade their coastal and their interior defense capabilities. Now, that's a war talk.
Does that sound like the movie where, you know, they had Slim Pickens strapped on a nuke as he hits to the ground and saying, "Yeehaw"?
Well, it's exactly what it is, but and how do you think the Russians see it? The Russian defense minister said, look, we've been trying to discuss this at NATO, but we're not allowed to come to NATO anymore because of the sanctions. The U.S. and the British are creating a war threat with Russia where none exists. And here's the other point that's always made. Russia's aggressive. Look what they're doing in the Middle East. Look what they're doing in Ukraine. Well, the Middle East we've covered extensively. What they're doing in the Middle East is what we said we were going to do, which is take out ISIS. Why aren't we working with them? Secondly, in Ukraine, the Russians moved to defend the Russian ethnic Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine when a neo-Nazi gang pulled off a coup run by Soros and Hillary Clinton and Victoria Nuland to put in power this guy Poroshenko, who's a corrupt oligarch. It was a coup. So here the Russians then, and by the way, the people in Kiev said they were prepared to suppress the Russian language in eastern Ukraine. So it was under those circumstances that you had self-defense forces emerge in eastern Ukraine, probably with some Russian support, but that's hardly an aggressive invasion of Western Europe.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing a warmonger, Obama, who is a satanic figure, who's operating on the post-World War II enemy image profiles given to him by the British intelligence networks that are behind this. And there's a very good article by Robert Parry that just appeared, P-A-R-R-Y, who said, look, all of this is being done to stop the BRICS. Now, this is what you and I have talked about for a long time, but it's finally beginning to hit some of these mainstream-type reporters that there's more to this than just miscalculation. There's an intent, a satanic intent.
Well, look at Obama's call for international tax reform in the Panama Papers. Maybe when we come back, we'll touch on that.
Oh, yeah.
Because all of this is all part of the web of disguise, disgust, and terror that they're trying to put on us. I just by chance pulled up the Panama Papers, and I want you to expand on that because you have some articles over at LaRouchePAZ.com. Expand on this because you have some new facts out that need to come out about what's really going on and the banks involved, etc.
Well, there are a couple of points here. Everyone heard that so-called Putin's friends are named in these papers. Now, the journalists who had these papers for a year couldn't find any direct connection to Putin. And there were a few Russian oligarchs in it, but there were a whole lot of other oligarchs, like Poroshenko, the pro-U.S. dictator in Ukraine. So the first thing is this was used to target Putin. Right. Now, the thing to realize is the group that did the leak, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, this is a George Soros front. Soros is part of the network, which includes Obama, which includes David Cameron, that's trying to overthrow Putin because Putin represents a threat to the collapsing financial system of the West.
Right. Well, it's not just that nation. There's also basically overthrows a government like the current situation in Argentina that's backed by these banks that are on the other side that we know are part of the corrupt system.
And this guy Macri, who's the new president of Argentina, who's trying to overturn everything done by the Kirchners, shows up in these Panama Papers as a guy who's laundered huge amounts of money. He's a typical corrupt oligarch. Now, two other points I just think are important. One, what are the banking agencies most responsible for these tax evasions that are covered in these papers? There are three of them. Hong Kong, Shanghai, HSBC. Why should we be surprised? Every criminal swindle that's done by bankers has an HSBC component. Secondly, Credit Suisse. Why should that be surprising? Their stock is collapsing. The bank is in trouble. They've lost 50% of their regulatory capital this year. Third bank, Union Bank of Switzerland. Who's one of their chief advisors? Phil Graham, who's now the chief advisor on economics to Ted Cruz. So here, Cruz, who says he's going to protect against tax swindles, has one of the leading tax swindlers in the world as his chief advisor.
Yeah, it just shows who he really is. In fact, I think there was a preemptive strike by the super PAC coordinated, which is illegal, by the way, between Cruz to attack Melania with the model picture of her laying in some kind of tub half naked. Basically is to make sure that Trump wouldn't bring up not Heidi Cruz's looks, but the fact that she's one of the co-authors of the North American Union, and a CFR member is actually part of the globalist scheme, and she's on loan, basically on leave, from Goldman Sachs. So people say it has nothing to do with her looks. It's what looks like on paper as to what she's written and how she's collaborated with literally creating, if you want to call it the globalist control and the New World Order. This is very real, and she's part of the deep part of it, and so is Cruz. These are nasty people.
Cruz is a blatant effort by the establishment to sneak someone in who seems like an opponent of the establishment, who's really a pimple on the butt of the establishment. I mean, he's nothing but a Bush figure, and the fact that they chose him to act egregious against the Senate so they could develop this anti-establishment image. But his policies are virtually the same as Obama's. Now, the final point I wanted to make about the Panama Papers, and people can get this, it's on LaRouche PAC website. I think you posted on your websites. It's called British Unleash Panama Papers to Escalate Regime Changes Globally, Provoke War. Here's the last point to make. The Mossack, who's part of the Mossack Fonseca law firm, which is the law firm whose papers were released, which show the extensive criminal activity to hide taxes, that law partner, Mossack, his father was a member of the Waffen-SS, which was the center of the Hitler killing machine. His father escaped Germany after World War II thanks to the Dulles brothers. Alan Dulles, who's as Wall Street as you can get, who was the head of the Byrne office of the Office of Strategic Services and later became CIA chief and probably oversaw the Kennedy assassination. Alan Dulles brought a lot of Nazis to South America after the war, took some of Hitler's gold with them so they could continue to operate, and they set up CIA outposts with these guys, and this guy Mossack was one of them. His son is the lawyer who's at the center of this Panama law firm that was involved in swindles of this sort. So what you see is British, and Wall Street networks that are engaging, 60 years after World War II ended, 70 years after World War II ended, to promote the same Hitler world order that they were promoting in the 30s. And that's what the American people have to understand. We're they're trying to play us for suckers to go against the leaders in the world who have rejected the Anglo-American policy. Why is Putin hated by Obama? He offered an olive branch. He said, let's work together to stop the terrorists that you don't want to, that you hate, ISIS and so on. Obama refused. We have been completely incompetent in fighting ISIS, or you could just say our strategy was deliberately set up to fail. But the Russians are succeeding.
Failure. Right. That's because we never intended to do so. On the one hand, we supply them with material and weapons. On the other hand, we continue to do a full war, which is a lie. We won't coordinate with ground forces from the Peshmerga forces or the Iraqi Shiite militia. It's just
or the Syrian army.
Or the Syrian army, and as a result, the problem grows and grows, and then now they're bringing in potential terrorists along with the so-called migrants, and if they had stabilized the Middle East, most of these people, a lot of them are now going back to Syria and Iraq because they want to go live in their own towns. And they're desolate towns, a lot of them destroyed. They're going to rebuild power stations, buildings, their homes, because they don't want to live in Europe. They don't feel like they're going to fit in, and they won't, especially if they're Muslim. Maybe if they're Christian, but if they're Muslim, they're not going to fit in, not now, not in 1 or 2 generations. And it's going to be...
Well, and this is what our conference is going to take up tomorrow. Schiller Institute conference will take up as part of its function how we could participate in a real Marshall Plan that would benefit the world and the United States. It wouldn't cost us very much money. The Europeans should be the ones who put in most of the money. But that what it would do would be to create jobs in the areas that have been destroyed by Bush and Obama. You know, this is something that people have to remember. The crisis in the Middle East goes back to Bush Sr. and the Afghan War. It was continued with Bush Jr. and the invasion of Iraq and the overthrow and murder of Saddam Hussein. It was extended by Hillary Clinton and Obama with the Libya operation and the demand for regime change in Syria. And it's made worse, as you pointed out. How do we help the terrorists? Well, who are our allies in the region? Saudi Arabia, which provides the Wahhabite religion as well as money to the terrorists, and Turkey, which is the logistics center for bringing personnel, fighters, and weapons into the ISIS forces in northern Syria.
And the conduit for the sale of the oil that goes to G20 nations, which
if
the G20 nations wouldn't buy their damned oil, they wouldn't have money to buy bombs and other things back from our military-industrial complex. It's disgusting what we're doing.
Well, and this is why Obama goes crazy whenever he hears the name Putin. Because Putin showed that not only is he an amateur when it comes to strategy, but that he's actually on the wrong side. You know, all the people who tried to prove that Obama's a secret Muslim and he's a Kenyan and he's this and that, Putin outflanked you. Putin showed that he's a liar and an incompetent.
Right. And not only that, he is collaborating with extreme Islam. At the same time, he's trying to criticize them and be a so-called superficial peacemaker when he's actually fomenting destruction and bringing the danger to, for example, the King of Jordan made a recent statement last week that he wants the West to stop this. Remember, he was a tank commander in the British military forces. He's trained and educated in England. He's not a stupid man. He's the King of Jordan. And he says, if you don't stop this, Jordan will fall, and if Jordan falls, they will then start going after Israel. And Israel, of course, did collaborate to set up ISIS, the town with Academy, or otherwise known as Blackwater Security in the CIA. What is going to happen if Israel gets pushed into the position of a Samson option? We are going to face World War III, and the idiot Obama is setting all the detonation charges to get it going, whether it's during his term or after. It's just disgusting. I was looking through my news items, and I had one here that I thought was quite funny. It is China to Donald Trump, you're hired. And, of course, the Chinese have kind of a funny sense of humor. They have some Chinese words. One is called big mouth and broken bed, or Chang Po, which is unflattering reference to shoddy construction. The fact is that there's $558 billion of exchange lost every year to China. And it doesn't mean it needs to be a win-fail system. It could be win-win. The Chinese can continue to expand their economy and make deals with us, but we don't need to export all our business over to China. We need to make certain that the companies that have the kind of incentives, for example, a flat tax. And you're never going to get either party. In fact, this lying piece of garbage Cruz says a flat tax. Neither party wants a flat tax. They'll lose their super PACs and their honeypot and all the money they get that they slide into their own personal bank accounts or foundations. They don't want a flat tax. They don't want to wipe out the debt like a LaRouche Foundation wants to get rid of it. They don't want to have Glass-Steagall that puts a firewall between investments by banks and the derivatives market. They don't want to have that. They want a system where I call the sea of corruption from the district of criminals continues to, feed these fish, these political fish, so they become big and bloated and become giant in size, economically and otherwise. That's why the richest homes in America, probably in the world, are in the Beltway around Washington, D.C. It's sickening.
Well, there's also this article which appeared in Bloomberg News just a few minutes ago, where Obama's talking about how there's lax tax policy and how the rest of the world has to come to terms with this. And then the article points out that the United States is one of two nations that's refusing to sign new agreements to pursue tax evasion, international agreements. The two countries that are not signing it, Panama and the United States. So under Obama, we've become the world's biggest criminal when it comes to facilitating the use of offshore accounts to launder drug money, to provide funds for terrorists, and so on. The reason Obama doesn't want this regulated is that this is what the CIA has been using to send arms through Turkey to ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Right.
And you have General Petraeus, who is a former CIA director, former great military hero, who is advocating that the United States, in order to get rid of Assad, should recognize al-Qaeda as moderate rebels.
Right.
Now, could you imagine I wish Petraeus would say that on national television, because that's, in fact, what Obama's policy is. Because when we support the umbrella groups under the term moderate rebels that we were defending in Aleppo and in other places, saying the Russians aren't hitting the terrorists, they're hitting the moderate rebels, they were hitting the terrorists. It's just that we didn't call them terrorists because they were al-Qaeda, and Obama has adopted al-Qaeda. Now, that's not surprising, because in a sense, Obama is the adopted stepson of the Bush family.
Right.
He is continuing W's policy and HW's policy. 41 and 43, Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. worked with Islamic fundamentalists directly with the bin Laden family and with the Saudi monarchy to build up the jihadists in Afghanistan who were behind with Saudi personnel who were involved in at least the cover story of the 9/11 attack, but continuing on with that through our policies in Iraq under George W. Bush, we organized the environment in which ISIS was created. We stepped aside and let them conquer much of Iraq and part of Syria. And when the Syrians fought back, Obama tried to arm al-Qaeda networks to stop the Assad government. Now, that's treason, because that is an example of activity which threatens American lives. And the fact that Republicans in the Congress say they don't like Obama, they don't like his executive orders, but they've been so gutless and corrupt that they haven't introduced a bill of impeachment. And that in this presidential campaign, that Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders cling to Obama like he's a life raft. It shows you the extent there's two-party collusion in complete corruption.
Well, the thing is that on the one hand, it's like they hold their nose while they're clinging to Obama. Because you can see the animus between Bill Clinton when he says it's a disaster for 8 years, right on video camera on the lectern, on the campaign trail. And we have Bernie Sanders trying to say he supports Obama when, in fact, everything that he stands for is directly opposed to what Obama's doing. Not what he says, but what he actually does. So it's bizarre to hear people say one thing, hold their nose like Hillary Clinton, and, of course, Bill Clinton is not as restrained. He's going to say what he wants to say, which is, bizarre. The same with their daughter. Chelsea.
Or look at Ted Cruz running around saying he's going to repeal Obamacare, he's going to rip up the Iran agreement, he's going to do all this. What has he done in the Senate for the last years to stop Obama? Nothing.
I don't see him stopping Did he stop the omnibus bill? Actually, continue to fund it? Did they stop the bombing campaign? Did they raise in the Senate the issue of why are you supporting al-Qaeda and ISIS and Nursa al-Qaeda at the same time he's publicly condemning them? It's a bizarre thing.
Is he taking a position on too big to fail? Of course not, because his wife worked for one of the too big to fail banking
and not talking
firms,
about walling off
Sachs.
not talking about walling off or preventing, for example, what's called bailing in, which means if your money's in a bank and you're considered an unsafe investor in that bank, they can give you a haircut, but the blade is below your chin. Well,
this is why, again, I'll just mention it one more time for your listeners. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock Eastern Time on LaRouchePAC.com, you'll get to see a keynote address by Helga Zepp-LaRouche at an international conference in New York City. We've had a series of these conferences in Frankfurt. Mrs. LaRouche spoke recently in India at a government conference there. My colleague Jeffrey Steinberg just spoke at the Moscow Economic Forum. He was the only American who was there, and he spoke on a panel which included people that were top Putin allies, and Jeffrey laid out the reason Russia is under attack is because of the BRICS and the threat that what the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, and others are doing is moving to set up a new financial system out from under the control of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, London, and Wall Street. If Americans recognize that that was the fight, that there really is an opportunity for the United States to break with Wall Street, break with London, get away from the war policy, and it starts by repudiating Obama And by repudiating him, I mean removing him from office because he's still in power and he's still doing dangerous things that threaten American lives.
I think that he is so dangerous, he may, with all of this melee happening in the election cycle of the candidates, he may precipitate a martial law by bringing these unfettered people coming in from these countries. And then, of course, he'll get a bipartisan bill with both the parties supporting it to have some form of martial law. There won't be an election. I think that the probability is increasing dramatically that that's going to happen, especially after Brussels and after Lahore, India, Pakistan. The chances of a major terrorist activity in America is becoming increasingly high. And after that, I guarantee there'll be a domestic security bill that both Mitch McConnell of the Republicans and the Democrats support. And we're going to all really pay for it, because I very seriously think that if that happens, there won't be a 2016 election. They'll call it delayed. For how long? I don't know, months or years.
Well, just as Bush did, using 9/11 as the excuse for the bad economy, which actually was starting long before 9/11, Obama will use terrorism or the threat of terrorism to say, well, gee, we fixed the economy, but this shook our foundations.
Yeah, he always lies. I mean, you know he's lying.
We're living in a collapsed system, Bill. That's the whole point. And the American people are complicit to the extent that we're not standing out there saying we've got to get rid of Obama and we've got to go with these new economic policies that take away power from the private interests of Wall Street and the City of London.
I'm going to steal a few words. I have a dream. I have a dream of a Trans-Alaskan to Asian pipeline. I have a dream of a high-speed rail so you can get on a train in Ireland, in Dublin, Ireland, and go transit across all of Europe and Eurasia, all the way through, from North America
San Diego.
right through. Yes, exactly. I want to see a system where you can get on a high-speed train from San Diego, where I live, San Diego, California, and you can then go to all of Vladivostok. I want to see a system where we are no longer we're beating, literally, as it says in front of the United Nations, we're beating our plowshares into pruning hooks. You know, that's only going to happen if we get rid of the corrupt banking system, which gains most of its power through war and chaos.
Just remember, tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Eastern on LaRouchePAC.com.
And the number to call to get involved directly with the agency and really get things going to try to support what's really happening, 800-922-2907, 800-922-2907. We'll see you next week. Harley, an excellent show.
Okay.
The Panama Papers was rich. That was funny and scary.
Yeah.
It shows you how crazy the system is and what the real solutions are.